Ambassador Zixathala of the Valorian Confederacy had expected many things when the mysterious humans finally responded to the galaxy's diplomatic overtures. Perhaps a delegation of frail, pale scholars draped in ceremonial robes. Maybe elderly statesmen with calculating eyes and soft voices. What she hadn't expected was Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos stepping off the transport shuttle with a grin that could power a fusion reactor and biceps that strained against her dress uniform. "Ma'am!" Santos snapped to attention with a precision that made the deck plates vibrate. Gunnery Sergeant Santos reporting for diplomatic duty. Zixthala's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a sign of deep confusion among her species. The human before her stood barely 1.7 meters tall, positively diminutive by galactic standards, yet something about her presence made the seasoned ambassador's survival instincts scream warnings. "Sergeant," Zixthala began carefully, "we were expecting diplomatic personnel?" "Yes, ma'am." Santos's smile somehow grew even brighter. "That's us. 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines, Diplomatic Corps. We're real excited to help out with your, She glanced at the datapad strapped to her wrist. Delicate interspecies territorial dispute requiring subtle negotiation. Behind Santos, 5 more humans filed out of the shuttle. Each one moved with the same predatory grace, the same unnervingly cheerful demeanor. They looked around, the pristine diplomatic station with the interest of tourists visiting a particularly exotic zoo. "Perhaps there's been a mistake," Zixthala ventured. "When we requested Earth's assistance with the Krextor expansion crisis, we specifically asked for diplomatic specialists." "Oh, we're specialists all right," chimed in Corporal Jackson, a lanky human whose casual stance somehow managed to position him with clear sightlines to every exit. "Sergeant Santos here has a degree in interspecies relations from the University of New Geneva. I've got my master's in conflict resolution. Chen over there? She speaks 7 galactic languages and has a PhD in cultural anthropology." Zixathala looked closer and noticed that beneath their military bearing, these humans did indeed carry themselves with intellectual curiosity. Santos was already studying the station's architecture with analytical eyes, while Chen was taking discreet notes on her tablet. "Right then," Zixthala said, deciding to proceed despite her misgivings. "Let me brief you on the situation. The Krextor Empire has been expanding aggressively into neutral space. They claim ancient territorial rights, but their methods have been brutal. 3 colonies have already fallen. The Galactic Council needs someone to negotiate a peaceful resolution." Santos nodded seriously. "Rules of engagement, ma'am?" "I beg your pardon. What can we do and what can't we do? Are we authorized to use force if negotiations break down?" "Absolutely not." Zixthala's chromatophores flashed bright orange in alarm. "This is a diplomatic mission. Violence is strictly forbidden." "Copy that, diplomacy only." Santos's expression remained perfectly serious, though something gleamed in her eyes. "When do we meet with the Krextor representatives?" 3 hours later, Zixthala found herself in the station's main conference chamber, watching in fascination, as the humans prepared for their first diplomatic encounter. They'd somehow transformed from casual soldiers into what appeared to be proper negotiators. Dress uniforms immaculate, posture formal, tablets and translation devices ready. The Krextor delegation arrived with typical imperial pomp. General Vashkar, a 3-meter-tall reptilian warrior whose scales bore the scars of a dozen campaigns, swept into the room surrounded by his equally imposing staff. His eyes immediately fixed on the humans with predatory interest. "So," Vashkar's voice rumbled like distant thunder, "Earth sends children to negotiate with the might of the Krextor Empire." Santos stood and offered a respectful bow. "General Vashkar, I'm Gunnery Sergeant Santos. We're honored to meet with such a distinguished warrior." Her tone was perfectly diplomatic, but Zixthala caught the way she'd subtly emphasized warrior, acknowledging his military status rather than his political position. "Warriors recognize warriors," Vashkar said, slightly mollified. "But you are soft creatures from a weak world. What could you possibly understand of strength?" "Well, sir," Santos replied with that same bright smile. Earth is what we call a Class 12 death world. Predators, natural disasters, hostile weather patterns, you know how it is. But I'm sure your empire has faced similar challenges in your expansion. The room fell silent. Zixthala's research indicated that most species evolved on Class 3 or core worlds at most. The Krextor homeworld was a relatively peaceful Class 6. Class 12? Vashkar's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Oh yes, sir, Chen piped up helpfully. Earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, volcanic eruptions, ice, ages, plagues, asteroid impacts, you name it. Our planets tried to kill us with it, but that's not really relevant to today's discussions. Jackson nodded agreement. Right, we're here to talk about your territorial expansion. From what I understand, you've encountered some resistance from the local populations? Vashkar straightened, his confidence returning. Resistance is expected. The weak always resist the strong before accepting their proper place. Absolutely, Santos agreed amiably. Back home, we had a saying, the strong do what they can, the weak suffer what they must. Of course, we also had another saying, everyone thinks they're the apex predator until they meet an actual apex predator. Something in the way she said it made the Krextor delegation shift uncomfortably. Santos maintained her cheerful expression throughout. But enough about Earth, she continued brightly. Let's talk solutions. I understand your empire needs resources and territory. The colonies you've targeted certainly have both. However, there might be more efficient ways to achieve your goals. For the next 4 hours, Zixthala watched in amazement as the human diplomats systematically dismantled the Krextor negotiating position. They never raised their voices, never made threats, never broke diplomatic protocol. Instead, they asked innocent questions that revealed flaws in Krextor's strategy, offered helpful suggestions that were obviously impractical, and shared amusing anecdotes about Earth's history that somehow always ended with the complete destruction of whoever had been foolish enough to pick a fight with humans. So after the Sino-American War, Jackson was saying, we figured out that orbital bombardment was actually pretty inefficient compared to just making the enemy surrender. Much less paperwork afterward. Your species achieved orbital bombardment capability? Another Krextor officer asked, clearly impressed despite himself. Oh, that was centuries ago, Chen waved dismissively. These days we've got much more interesting toys. But like Sergeant Santos said, we're here to talk peace, not war. By the end of the session, General Vashkar looked like a reptile who'd just realized he'd been hunting in a tiger preserve. The Krextor delegation agreed to consider a phased withdrawal from disputed territories in exchange for enhanced trade opportunities with Earth. As the aliens filed out, Zixthala approached. Santos, that was remarkable. You achieved more in one afternoon than the Galactic Council has managed in months. Santos's grin returned full force. Ma'am, there's something you should understand about Marines. We're not just warriors, we're problem solvers. Sometimes the problem requires bullets, sometimes it requires bullets and diplomacy, and sometimes... She watched the Krextor delegation disappear down the corridor. Sometimes it just requires letting folks know that you could solve their problem with bullets, but you'd really rather not have to. And if they'd refused your diplomatic solutions? Well, ma'am, Santos said, her smile never wavering. That's when we would have had to get creative. Good thing it didn't come to that. I hear the paperwork for cultural misunderstandings is a real nightmare. Zixthala decided she didn't want to know what getting creative might have entailed. Instead, she made a mental note to recommend that future diplomatic crises be handled exclusively by humans, preferably these particular humans, who somehow managed to make speak softly and carry a big stick look like an art form. After all, as Santos had mentioned, everyone thought they were an apex predator until they met an actual apex predator. The galaxy was just fortunate that Earth's apex predators had learned to smile while they worked,